How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today was the Daf Samach Vav, Daf 66 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, on Daf Samach Vav, we wrap up our discussion of grasshoppers and wrap in our discussion of fish. The requirement of fins and scales for fish. Yeah, I think it should be a cool daf. We are going to get into some klal and prat, riboy and miuti kinds of things around fins and scales to try to understand in what context it does apply and in what context it does not apply. I think it should be cool. I think we should enjoy ourselves and have a great time studying Daf Samach Vav, Daf 66 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Samach Vav of Masechta Chullin. I'd say a little bit more than halfway through the Amid at the two dots. Amr Mar, we had said earlier, Shmai Chagav Yachol Ein Bo Kol Asimanim Alalu. We had entertained the thought, the notion that perhaps if you have a grasshopper that has none of the four simanim. What are the four simanim? 4 legs, 4 wings that cover most of its body, and 2 jumper legs. If it has none of those things, well, if you're wondering if that's 3, meaning 4 legs is 1, 4 wings that cover most of its body is a separate thing, so that's already 3, and then the jumper legs is a 4th requirement. So we had asked, what if there is a grasshopper that has none of these simanim, but it is called a chogov? Is it possible that we can enjoy snacking on it? Therefore, the puzzle says, Lit mineu, ad shehu bo kol asimanim alalu. No, it needs to have all of these signs. But for the Gemara, ein bo kol asimanim alalu, mehecha teisi. But for the Gemara, I don't understand. If it has, why should we even have a havamina? Why should we entertain the notion that a grasshopper that has none of the simanim, we can snack on it? Arbe v'chargol ksib. After all, right? The psukim say arbe chargol. These are grasshoppers that have the 4 simanim. We should only be able to include things that are similar. Other grasshoppers that have the 4 simanim. Ilo ksiv salom kideko amr. Look, if we only had arbe and chargol, and we didn't have salam, I hear your argument. Arbe and chargol have the 4 simanim. We should only be able to include other things that have the 4 simanim. There's nothing to talk about it, and nothing to talk about if it lacks all 4 simanim. However, salam aruch. However, now that we do have salam, and from salam we included even a grasshopper with a long head, which is different than all the others, which have shorter heads. So ema lirbi nami koldu. So I might think that we can include even a grasshopper with none of the 4 simanim, and that's different than all the other grasshoppers, kamash malon, and therefore we have limineu to say that no, don't include grasshoppers that lack all of the simanim. Maishna awesome de omrat salam ze roshin chargol ze nipol. Umaishna hocha de omrat salam ze nipol chargol ze roshin. Basically, right, in one place we had said chargol and salam are either Russian or nipol. In the other place we said that they are the opposite. And for the Gemara, my kiasre or my kiasre, well, it just depends. In wherever the brisa of the Torah's Kohanim was taught, so they said that salam is there. They would refer to salam as Russian and chargol as nipol, and by wherever the Tanit Ver Bishmo was, they referred to salam as nipol and chargol as Russian. But at the end of the day, lemaisa, the result is going to be the same result. All right, friends, now we are moving on to fish. We're going to discuss fish. That when it comes to fish, we can eat fish that have fins and scales. Says the Gemara, Ein lo achshov v'asa l'gadol. What if you have a fish? I don't know, what are examples of this? Oh, we're going to give some examples. So what if you have a fish that doesn't currently have scales, but I guess even fins and scales, I guess. But in the future, it is going to grow them. So kigon, and we're going to give some examples of what a fish that might grow some later are. Hasultanis va'afion. The sultanis and afion, they sound delicious. It's permitted. So if they don't currently have fins and scales, but they will have fins and scales in the future, that is fine. It's a kosher fish. Yeshlo achshav, if it currently has fins and scales. I assume that we're talking really about the scales. I assume that if you have fins, you're probably born with fins, I imagine. But scales, I guess you could probably be born without them and grow them later. Or if they have scales, but they are going to, but before, but at some point the scales come off of the fish. Kigon, for example, akunas va'afunas, kasaftias va'achasaftias va'atunas. Those fish. Hareza mutter, also mutter. Okay, so if you have fish that have scales and are going to shed them, or do not have scales but are going to grow them, in either scenario, those would be considered kosher fish. Tanan Hosam, we learn in a Mishnah, in Masechta Nida, Kol sheyesh lo kashkeshes yesh lo snapir. Any fish that has scales has fins. V'yesh sheyesh lo snapir ve'ein lo kashkeshes. There are fish, however, that have fins but don't have scales. For example, a shark. Right? So we're saying that all fish with scales have fins, but you have fish that have fins that don't have scales. Yesh lo kaskeses v'yesh lo snapir dogtar. If it has fins and scales, it is a kosher fish. Yesh lo snapir v'ein lo kaskeses dogtar. If it has fins but no scales, it is a tamei fish. So, for example, we can't eat shark. One second. So if ultimately the key thing here is the scales, right? Fins alone is not enough. Scales alone are not enough either, but we say that the Mishnah in Nida had said that any fish that has scales, memela, has fins. So really, the key element here is really this. The scales is what everything's really dependent on. So why do we need to say that there are two simanim by fish, fins and scales? Technically speaking, you really only need the scales. Because of snapir. So the Gemara says, because if the Torah had only said kaskeses, but had left out snapir, Hava amina, my kaskeses snapir. I may have thought, what is kaskeses? Maybe kaskeses means fins. And a fish that has fins, like a shark, maybe would be kosher. Even fish that we know to be non-kosher, we may have thought would be kosher because of achmana snapir v'kaskeses. So the Torah says snapir and kaskeses, so that we know that there are two requirements, and therefore one of them is going to be fins. The other will be scales. Okay, fine. So we have snapir, we have kaskeses, fins and scales. How do we know which one is which? How do we know that kaskeses are the scales, that kaskeses are the ones that cover its body? The Chsiv, as the Pasuk says, in the context of Goliath, Vishiryon kaskosim ulavush, that he was adorning armor of like chain link armor, of kaskasim, of scales. And therefore, so it says, right, so the armor, the body armor that Goliath was wearing is described as armor of kaskasim, which therefore means that kaskasim are a form of something that you wear. And therefore, kaskasim would be the scales rather than the fins. V'lichtov rachmana kaskeses v'lo lichtov snapir. So the Gemara says, well, now if essentially we have a raya from this from Shmuel, right, from the Novi, that kasim, that the shirion kasim means essentially something that you adorn, and therefore the kaskeses must be the scales. So going back to our original question, can't we just write kaskeses? Ultimately, all we need is scales, because if there are scales, memela there are fins. Just write kaskeses. We said, well, then how would we know? Maybe kaskeses is fins. Kaskeses are not fins. We have a pasuk from Shmuel, which from Shmuel Aleph, right? Yeah, it's got to be. Yeah. That we have a pasuk from Shmuel Aleph that kaskasin means essentially something that you adorn. Must be the scales. So just have kaskeses. So Babble, v'chintayt v'bishmol, yagdil Torah v'yadir. Honestly, it's a little bit tricky for me to understand exactly what it means, but essentially, I think the short, we could have just had kaskeses, but we kind of add more different angles to have different opportunities to be able to darshan the Torah in different ways. What Tosfos says, Harbe Amar Lanu Taimim Ledemau Kaskeses, that the Torah gave us lots of different ways of arriving at the conclusion of what kaskeses is. There's the pasuk from Shmuel Aleph describing Goliath. We also have snapir and kaskeses in order to know that that there's fins and scales. I guess different ways of us, different kind of steps along the way, adding on different layers of our understanding of what makes and contributes to a kosher fish. And now the Gemara discusses this requirement of fins and scales. In what context is it required? That if you want to consume a fish from from a river or something like that, so we'll say that fish requires fins and scales. But what if you're drinking a glass of water, and perhaps in that glass of water there might be some little shirtzei amayim, there might be little bugs in the water, and those bugs don't have fins and scales. So now, is the requirement of fins and scales there as well? Can you drink a glass of water if there might be little bugs in it? Interesting shaila. So basically, let's leave it at that, and let's see. Okay, so when it comes to the requirement for fins and scales, there are 3 psukim in Sefer Vayikra Perek Yud Aleph. Sefer Vayikra Perek Yud Aleph pasuk Tes says, "Es zeh tochlu mikol asher b'mayim." The following you can eat from that is in the water. Kol asher lo snape v'kaskeses b'mayim bayomim uvanecholim osam tochelu. You can eat those. Eat the fish that have fins and scales. Now, if the Torah says eat the fish that have fins and scales, what's the inverse? What does it imply? Don't eat fish that don't have fins and scales. Now, the next pasuk Yud, as well as pasuk Yud Aleph, read V'chol asher ein lo snapi v'kaskeses. If it has no fins and scales, Bayom v'necholim kol sheretz amayim umikol nefesh achai asher b'amayim sheketz eim lochem, and continues to pasuk Yud Aleph v'sheketz yulachem b'sarim lo sochil v'snivlosom tishaketzu. That the Torah then says, so first, okay, then the Torah subsequently says, if the fish lack fins and scales, don't eat them. So you can argue that the Torah essentially says these things twice. Eat fish that have fins and scales is one thing, and it seems to say that twice. And the second thing that it's saying twice is fish that lack fins and scales, don't eat them. Why is that? Well, we're going to figure out why that is, but what does it mean that it's saying it twice? It means that, well, in the first pasuk, where it says, when a fish has fins and scales, eat it, well, that implies if it doesn't have fins and scales, don't eat it. The next psukim then say, fish that don't have fins and scales, don't eat them, which then implies that if they do have fins and scales, eat them. So it sounds like we're basically saying the same thing twice. So again, once the pasuk says echol es sheyeshlo, eat fish that have fins and scales, well, shomea ani al tochal es she'ein lo. Well, essentially that also teaches me the inverse, which is fish that lack fins and scales, don't eat them. But then when the Torah says don't eat fish that lack fins and scales, shomea ani, well then I understand the inverse, which is echol es sheyeshlo, eat fish that have fins and scales. Velama shanon, why repeat them? Lavar olav be'ese velosase, in order to make clear in the Torah that one who eats finless and scaleless fish is not only violating a mitzvah's essay of eat fin-full and scale-full fish, but is also in violation of the mitzvah's lo saseh of don't eat finless and scaleless fish. Basically, if you eat a fish that lacks fins and scales, you are in violation of mitzvah's essay of eat fish with fins and scales, and mitzvah's lo saseh of don't eat fish that don't have fins and scales. Tochlu mikol asher b'moyim ma Talmud lomar. Now, for anybody who was analyzing these psukim with a very critical eye, may have noticed that in the first pasuk it says es zeh tochlu mikol asher b'mayim. This you shall eat. Tochlu, eat it. And then once again, osam tochelu, eat them. In that first pasuk, it mentions eating these fish twice. Why not just say it once? So the Gemara asks, Tochlu mikol asher b'moyim ma Talmud lomar. What is the Torah teaching us when it says, essentially, eat these fish with fins and scales twice? So the Gemara assumes that the second one is the one that's necessary. When it says osam tochelu, that's the one that's essentially teaching us eat the fish with fins and scales. So then why do we need the first one, which is tochlu mikol asher b'moyim? So that's what the Gemara asks. Tochlu mikol asher b'moyim ma Talmud lomar. What are we learning from that additional tochlu mikol asher b'moyim ma Talmud lomar sheyochol? Because I may have thought the following: Hol hitir b'meforish v'hitir b'stam. Makshi hitir b'meforish lo hitir ela b'kelim. Av kshitir b'stam lo hitir ela b'kelim. Minan the rabbis bo shichun umayris sheshoche v'shosemen ve'enu nimna Talmud lomar tochlu mikol asher b'moyim. What's going on here? What's it permitting? What's stam? What's meforish? Stam and meforish we'll get to tomorrow. But what are we talking about? What we're talking about is the following. Let's have another look at that first pasuk. As zeh tochlu mikol asher b'moyim. I'm reading you the pasuk. The following you shall eat from that which is in the water. Kol asher lo snabi b'kaskeses, if it has fins and scales. But then the pasuk continues. B'moyim b'yomim uvanecholim. The Torah then got more specific than just all fish in all waters. The Torah specified which waters are we talking about that you need fins and scales? B'yomim uvanecholim, seas and streams. Fish that you fish out of the sea and of a stream, you can only eat that fish if it has fins and scales. However, if you have a kli, if you have a glass of water, and in that water there might be little bugs that don't have fins and scales, would you be, right, as we said earlier, right, if you eat fish that lack fins and scales, you're in violation of mitzvahs essay and mitzvahs lo saseh. Would the same apply if you drink that glass of water and maybe there's tiny little bugs in it? Would you be in violation of mitzvahs essay and mitzvahs lo saseh? You wouldn't. Because the pasuk says specifically the requirement for fins and scales is in yomim and necholim, not in a glass of water. Let's read that again. Why does the pasuk say tochlu mikol asher b'mayim, that you can eat whatever's in the water? Sheyochel, I may have thought to say hoyel v'hitir b'meforish v'hitir b'stam, that just like the Torah permitted water, that permitted shirtzei amayim, these little bugs in water that lack fins and scales, and v'hitir b'mefarish, it explicitly permitted them, v'hitir b'stam, and also implicitly permitted them. Tomorrow we're going to, already now we're going to get into what possibly could be implicit and explicit. Tomorrow we're going to label it properly, but we're going to already start getting into it now. Let's keep on going. Yeah, it's a little bit not tricky, but all right. Anyways, basically there are, we mentioned earlier these two psukim, right? That the Torah says, eat fish that have fins and scales. And the Torah also says, don't eat fish that lack fins and scales. So the implication is, eat fish that have fins and scales in yamim and nechalim, in rivers, in seas and streams. However, if we're talking about a glass of water, in a glass of water, that requirement is not required. In a glass of water, you don't need the fins and scales. Now, we also have the second pasuk of fish that lack fins and scales, don't eat them, but it says there as well, seas and streams, implying that in a glass of water, however, there wouldn't be that same issue. Even though they lack fins and scales, these little bugs you would not be in violation of any mitzvahs essay and lo tasi. So basically, we have two verses which have this implication that the whole fins and scales thing is in seas and in streams. In terms of a glass of water, don't worry about it. So we're saying one of those, whether it is the first pasuk which says eat fish with fins and scales, or whether it's the second pasuk which says don't eat fish that lack fins and scales, both of them are implying that in a glass of water, however, the fins and scales thing is not a concern. So we're saying one of those psukim is explicit and one of them is implicit. We are not going to get into today which is the explicit one and which is the implicit one. For now, it's enough just to know that one of them is explicit, the other one is implicit, i.e. that there are two verses which we're learning this concept from, that in a glass of water, there's no requirement for fins and scales. So now, again, why does it say that since the requirement for fins and scales is waived in a glass of water, explicitly and implicitly from two psukim, so just like the implication of the first pasuk is that in vessels, in glasses of water, fins and scales are waived. Okay, so also in the second pasuk, the waiving of the requirement for fins and scales is also in vessels. How do we know, however, that also in pits, ditches, and caves, the requirement for fins and scales is also waived? That if you find a pit that's filled with water and you will drink from it, the mitzvahs essay and lo taseh regarding fins and scales does not apply to that pit, that ditch, or that cave. That you can lean over, bend down, and drink from it. You don't have to refrain from doing so. Talmud lomar tochlu mikol asher b'moim. Therefore, the pasuk says that you may eat whatever is in the water. Tochlu asher kol asher b'moim is coming to teach that that it's not limited to only glasses of water, but even in a pit, a ditch, or a cave, you can drink that water without concern of, well, do we require fins and scales? No, there's no requirement of fins and scales by Boris Sheikh Maris, and that is learnt out from Tochlu Mikol Asher B'Mayim. You can consume whatever is in the water, even though they lack fins and scales, when we're talking about Boris Sheikhin Umaris. I'm going to have a schluck of coffee and we're going to go weiter. Okay. Now, frag the Gemara, Heichan Hitir Bekelim. Where did we waive the requirement of fins and scales? Or honestly, is it waived, or I guess it probably never really applied in the first place? When it comes to glasses of water, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Tichsiv, as the Pasuk says, Es ze tochlu mikol asher b'moim v'gomer, bayomim uvanecholim, that the Pasuk had said that you can eat fish so long as they have fins and scales. Bayomim uvanecholim, in seas and in streams. This requirement for fins and scales, that if the fish has fins and scales, eat it. If it lacks fins and scales, leave it alone. Don't eat it. That is bayomim uvanecholim. That is limited to seas and to streams. Habekelim, but a glass of water, afalgav deleisle echol. Even if there are bugs in there that lack fins and scales, you can still drink the water nonetheless. Ema bekelim afagav de isle lo seichol. So the Gemara asks an interesting question. The Gemara challenges this and says, wait a second. Maybe what's happening is the following. In seas and streams, you're allowed to eat fish under what circumstances? If it has fins and scales. I.e., by default, you're not allowed to eat any water creatures. There is a special dispensation for seas and streams. In seas and streams, you can eat fish if they have fins and scales. But that's limited to seas and streams. If you're going to ask about a glass of water, nothing. No dispensations there. Not even with fins and scales. So again, Ema, I'll say, Bekelim afagav de isle lo seichel, that in a vessel, even if this whatever is swimming in there has fins and scales, you still can't eat it. Lo sakadaitech tichsiv, because the pasuk says v'chol asher ein lo snape v'kaskeses, because the pasuk then says later that, right, basically the psukim right afterwards say if the fish lacks fins and scales, bayomim uvanecholim, in seas and streams, mikol sheretz hamoim, anything in the water, bayomim uvanecholim deleisle lo seichol, that when the pasuk says if it lacks fins and scales, don't eat it. Again, that's limited to seas and streams, habekelim, but in vessels afagav deleisle echol. But in vessels, even if whatever you're going to be consuming lacks fins and scales, it's not a problem. The lack of fins and scales is a problem only in seas and streams. It's okay when it comes to a glass of water. So that is the correct implication. And therefore, when we're talking about a glass of water, even if whatever you're drinking and whatever might be swimming around in there lacks fins and scales, it is permitted. There is a valid question of why is the second pasuk any better of a source than the first pasuk in terms of determining that we're talking about that in a glass you can consume even what's swimming around in there without fins and scales. Tosfos asks the kasha. I'm not going to get into it. It's just very technical, but it is a legitimate question. You can check out Tosfos Lo Salkadaitech if you're interested. But anyways, for now, we have arrived at the conclusion that in a glass of water, if there's little buggies that might be, if there's like little swimmy things that might be swimming in there, it would not be a violation of the requirement of fins and scales. Ve'ema b'mayim klal. Okay, so now we get into, and this is essentially going to take us to the end of the daf, and where it's also going to kind of take us. I'd like to really continue on to Samach Zayin Amud Aleph, because we're now going to see suggestions about how we can learn these psukim that we've been working with the requirement of fins and scales, as a klat, uprat, uklal, or as riboy and miut. So we'll work through those options together, and that is going to be kind of what is going to take us for the duration of the daf. So now, frag the Gemara, ve'ema, I will suggest the following suggestion. B'moyim klal, that when, okay, so again, let's have a look at this first pasuk. As zeh tochlu mikol asher b'moyim. So b'moyim, right, this you can eat whatever's in the water. B'moyim, in water, is a klal, a general statement. You can eat, right, that whatever we're going to say in this pasuk applies to whatever is in water. Okay? Kol asher lo snabi v'kaskes b'moyim. Again, it says water. Bayomim v'anacholim, and then it specifically mentions seas and streams. So we want to say that maybe this should be darshaned as klal ufrat. Right, again, ve'ema b'moyim klal. Right, it says b'moyim, so it's a general statement in water. Bayomim v'anacholim prat. But when it says bayomim uvanacholim, seas and streams, it's specifying particular types of waters, seas and streams. Klal ufrat, and of course the rule goes that when you have a general statement, water, followed by specifics, seas and streams, ein bichlal ela ma shebifrat. So of course the rule goes that basically when you have a general rule followed by a specific rule, the specific rule is coming to say that this is the only show in town. Right, that when we said water initially, but then followed that up by seas and streams, it means we're only talking about seas and streams, i.e., the requirement for fins and scales is entirely limited to seas and streams. Yomim v'nechalim in ne'itzin b'charitzin, but even canyons and ponds, fish in canyons and ponds. If you take a fishing rod and go to a pond, whatever comes out of that pond, there would be no requirement for fins and scales. The requirement for fins and scales is limited to seas and streams. B'mayim chazav v'cholal. However, you can't say that because it says b'mayim a second time in that pasuk, which makes it not just a klal ufrat, but a klal ufrat uklal. You have two general statements with one specific. It says b'mayim, which is general, water in general. It says bayomim uv'nechalim, seas and streams. And it says b'mayim, again, water generally a second time, which makes it a klal ufrat uklal. And how do klal ufrats uklals work? That when you have a general rule followed by a specific rule, followed once again by a general rule. So when you have the first klal, yamim, water, mayim, water, and then yamim and nechalim, seas and streams, specific, limited to seas and streams. And then once again you have mayim, water again. It's saying, okay, it's not limited only to seas and streams, but it's being expanded to now include things that are similar to seas and streams. What is similar to it? So it's not just including anything. Initially when it said b'mayim, it's including all sorts of water. Then when it says bayom v'nechalim, we're saying no, it's specifically seas and streams. When it says b'mayim, another time it's expanding the requirement to include water that is similar to seas and streams. What's water that's similar to seas and streams? Ponds, canyons. These are both. They are also bodies of water that come from that emanate from well springs, and therefore the requirement for fins and scales applies also to canyons and to ponds. But in fact, the Gemara, a very valid question. But if you look at the pasuk, as we will do again, we're looking at this pasuk a lot. That's the first klal, mayim. Kol asher snapi v'kaskes is b'mayim. That's the second klal, mayim again. Where's the prat? Bayom u'vancholim. Only after the second klal comes the prat to say seas and streams. So can we really say that this is klal, ufrat, uchlal, when the fact of the matter is, technically speaking, it's really klal, ufrat? So ani trei klali desmichel adodinu. But these two klals are right next to each other. Ravina says, Ravina, kide'ami b'mayrove, it's like they say in Eretz Yisrael. What do they say in Eretz Yisrael, where I live? Kol mokum sha'ata motze, shnei klalos asmuchen ze lazeh. Whenever you have a scenario like we have, two klals that are next to each other, hatel prat b'neim v'dunam b'chlal ufad uchlal. Take that prat, shift it over, sandwich it between the two klals, and learn it as a klal ufrat uchlal. Bamayim klal, and therefore when it says in water, that's a general rule, water. Bayomim uvanecholim prat, seas and streams, that is a prat, a specific. Bamoyim chazer v'cholal, and then when it says bamoyim a second time, it is expanding upon the prat. Klal ufrat uchlal iatadon ele ke'ena prat. We're going to learn like the prat, like yamim and necholim, ma prat meforish maim novim, just like seas and streams are waters that emanate from well springs, from beneath the ground. So I've called maim novim, my rabbi charitzim v'neitzin le'isura. So we're saying that all bodies of water that emanate from well springs, including ponds and canyons, have a requirement for fins and scales of whatever you're going to eat from them. And what is excluded? Boris, shichin, umayris, leatera. That pits, ditches, and caves, you don't need a requirement of fins and scales. If you're going to find a ditch someplace and drink some water from it, even if there might be things in that water that are alive and don't have fins and scales, you can drink that water nonetheless. I assume that we're talking about like really small. I mean, it'd be kind of nasty to like eat actual bugs and stuff. I assume that we're talking about like if there might be inevitable things floating in that water. Yeah, I mean, I assume most of us probably would prefer to drink, like bottled water or something, but Akoponim was saying it's not a violation of the fins and scales requirement. Okay, so what have we said? So we have said so far that the requirement for fins and scales for fish would be in streams, would be in seas, would be in ponds, as well as canyons. There would be no requirement for fins and scales in pits, ditches, caves, glasses of water. Ve'ema, but suggests the Gemara, ma prat miforish maim gedelin al gabe karka, I've called maim gedelin al gabe karka, or my rabbi afilu bar shichin umayris li yisura. In fact, the Gemara, wait, but maybe the angle is like this, that yamim and necholim, seas and streams, are essentially bodies of water that is gathered on ground, and it can even include pits, ditches, and caves. The only thing excluded from the fins and scales requirement is a glass of water. But the pits, ditches, and caves, you can only consume things with fins and scales. And kain tochlu mayahanile. But then what are we learning out from tochlu? Remember, there's also tochlu, right? Meaning we've been so focused on mayim, yom nechalim, mayim. We're forgetting that at the beginning of the pasuk there was that also tochlu mikol asher b'mayim. which was extra because it says at the end of the pasuk, Osam Tochelu. What are we learning out from Tochlu Mikol Shebamayim? That needs to serve a purpose. There has to be a reason for it being there. The reason for it being there is to tell you that in terms of the Klal Ufrat Uchlal, we're coming to say that seas and streams, as well as canyons and ponds, require fins and scales. And when the pasuk says Tochlu Mikol Shebamayim, that you can consume whatever is in the water, that's coming to include as well Boris Shichin Umaris, that you can consume whatever is in that water, even though they lack fins and scales, even when we're talking about Boris, Shichin, and Myris, there's no requirement of fins and scales. The Vera Bishmuel Tana. Now, in the Bismejit of Bishmuel, they learned this out not as a klal ufrat uchlal, but rather as a ribui, miut, and ribui. It's the same net result, but a different mechanism. Dvir b'shmol tana b'mayim shtei paimim ein ze klal ufrat ela riba umiet. This is not a klal ufrat, rather it's a ribui and a miut. What's the difference between a klal and a frat and a ribui and a miut? It's a little different. How is it a little different? Well, as we discussed earlier, when you have a klal ufrat, so you have a general rule, in this case water, yomim and chalim, we're limiting it to seas and streams. So when you're talking about klal ufrat, we would say it's limited only to seas and streams. The requirement for fins and scales is limited only to seas and streams. When you have the second klal, it's expanding it to even include things that are similar to seas and streams, like canyons, like ponds. Okay, that's how klal ufrat uchlal works. Ribui and miut would be the following: mayim, water, everything. Yomim and necholim, it limits water to things that are similar to seas and streams. Essentially, ribui and miut, where you have the same result from just the ribui and the miut of where you got to at the end of the klal ufrat uchlal. So you had a klal, prat, followed by another klal that included things similar to seas and streams, in our example. When you have ribui and miut, the ribui and the miut is that initially the mayim is all water, yomim and chalim is limiting it to things similar to seas and streams, and then when you have the additional mayim, that's coming to include everything. And what purpose does the limitation of seas and streams serve? It'll just exclude one scenario. That's how ribui and miut. So basically, ribui, miut, and ribui is more inclusive. It basically includes everything, and the miut just excludes one example. Whereas klal ufrat uchlal, the result is that we're only including things that are similar to the prat, and we're going to be excluding everything else. So now, using the construct of ribui and miut, the very bishmol tana b'mayim shtei paimim ein ze klal ufrat ela riba umiet, that this is a ribui and a miut. B'mayim riba, first it says b'mayim, bayom v'necholim miet, b'mayim chazer v'riba, riba umiet v'riba, riba hakol, we include everything. My Rabbi, okay, so what are we including when we're saying we're including everything? Even charitzin v'neitzin li'isur, to say not just rivers, not just seas and streams, but even canyons and ponds. Umay, technically, oh yeah, that's correct. Charitzin and neitzin, canyons and ponds. Now, umay mi'et, and what is excluded by yomim and necholim, the miut, so what's excluded? Boris shichin umayris letera, to say that pits, ditches, and caves, there is no requirement of fins and scales. Ema, I'll suggest, my riba, what's included? Boris shichin umayris leisura. Umay miet kalim. Wait, but maybe I'll say that what are we coming to include in the requirement of fins and scales, even boris shichin umayris? Then when we say the riboy followed by a mute followed by another riboy, we're coming to include everything, even including pits, ditches, and caves. If you're going to eat anything from them, there's a requirement for fins and scales. And the mute is only excluding vessels. Imkain tochlu mai ahanile. But then what do you need tochlu? Again, there's the mayim, there's the yamim and chalim, there's the mayim again, but there's also tochlu. When the pasuk says eat anything in the waters, it's got to be there for a reason. So rather it must be that the riboy, the net result of the riboy, miut, riboy, is to say that there is a requirement. So ultimately what we're saying is that there is a requirement for fins and scales in streams and seas, in canyons and ponds. However, pits, ditches, and caves, as well as, of course, glasses of water, there is no requirement for fins and scales. Ve'ipuch ano, well, in terms of what we're including and excluding, let's say that the requirement of fins and scales applies to pits, ditches, and caves, but ponds and canyons, you can consume from them without fins and scales. So the Gemara says, no, don't say that. Kidetani matisyo, it's like Matisya teaches the Sanya, Detani matisyo, Bar Yehuda, my ra'isa l'rabos boris shichin umaris le'etera. How come we're saying that pits, ditches, and caves, you can drink from them without a requirement of fins and scales? Ulahotzi charishin and isin le'isura, and to say that canyons and ponds require fins and scales. My ba'ani boris shichin umaris, that pits, ditches, and caves do not require fins and scales, shein atzurin kekelim, because they are like vessels in that the water in them is static. Water in a vessel, in a cup, is static. Water in a pit is static. And therefore, just like water in a cup, there's no requirement for fins and scales. Also in a pit, a ditch, or a cave, there's no requirement of fins and scales. Now, canyons and ponds, their water is not static. Their water comes from underground well springs, and therefore they are like seas and streams, and there is a requirement for fins and scales in them. So therefore the net result, according to everybody, is that there's a requirement for fins and scales in seas, in streams, in ponds, in canyons. There is no requirement of fins and scales in glasses of water, in pits, in ditches, in caves. Friends, that was Daf Samach Vav, Daf 66 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, on Daf Samach Vav of Masechta Chullin, we wrapped up our discussion of grasshoppers and moved on to our discussion of fish. We learned that the requirement for fish is that it has fins and that it has scales. That could even be fish that initially don't have scales but get them fins and scales but get them later, or fish that do have fins and scales but shed, I imagine, the scales at some later point. We had discussed that any fish that has scales also has fins, but it could have fins without scales, and therefore, there was a question of why, if that's the case, why do we need fins and scales to be written? Well, because in order, if it only said one, you might think that maybe that's only fins and you can eat sharks and things. But we said no, it's fins and scales. And then we got into a whole discussion of in what context there is this requirement of fins and scales. And ultimately, where we landed is that if you can eat fish from a sea, from a stream, from a pond, from a canyon, the fish must require fins and scales. Now, if you're drinking water from a glass of water, from a pit, a ditch, a cave, and you're drinking water, there might be some small little sheretz hamayim's in there, and they don't have fins and scales, would you be in violation of the asay and the lo taseh around the requirement for fins and scales? No, you would not be. Friends, that was Daf Samach Vav, Daf 66 of Masechta Chullin. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great, great day.